AskReddit by Cohen 5250. What are some things the USA actually does better than Europe? Every time this is asked, the top answer is usually national parks. Final answer: reserved, protected national parks. I think it's also the infrastructure around the parks. I'm an Aussie and we have plenty of big scale national parks as well, but nowhere near the infrastructure supporting them, such as regular bathrooms, management staff, entry and exits, etc. That said, the US style is more a pay-to-play product and the Aussie style is a leave-it-alone method. And one could argue that minimal touch is a good thing, but I've been to more national parks in the US than Australia over the last 5 years because of access and facilities. Mexican food lol. Mexican food is legitimately the #1 thing I miss about the US. The quality of Mexican food abroad makes me cry. From what I read, disabled folks' accessibility, like handicap parking, accessible bathrooms, ramps, etc. I've seen this relatively often. Is this correct? Yeah, probably. Both the ADA and the EU national legislation on the subject concern new builds, additions and alterations. The older the housing and building stock, the worse it is. In many cases it's simply cheaper to build something new on the outskirts of the city than to adapt existing buildings when they need to be altered for whatever other reason. Here in Little Tokyo, Los Angeles, we have a Japanese restaurant owned by Koreans. Chefs are mostly Mexican, and somehow no one is really fluent in English except for a few servers. This describes many places in CA, not just LA. Probably many places in other states with large immigrant populations, that is, TX, as well. American Disabilities Act Amendments Act totally covers people with epilepsy. It's really incredible, speaking as an epileptic who moved to the US from overseas. The blues. Most music genres that came after the blues were influenced by the blues or based on the blues, especially rock. When we were in Scotland we were being a bit self-deprecating about being American, and this English guy we were talking to brought up how American music has hugely affected the rest of the world. I had never really thought about it like that. Not paying to use the toilet. Largely thanks to this group's agitation in the 1970s, https://en.m.wiki.org/wiki/committee_end_pay_toilets_in_America. I concur with this. I'm from New Zealand and have lived on both continents. The US is far easier to meet people and settle in. Concur with what? Comparing as someone who had lived in France, the USA, and the UK. Salaries. Vastly superior in the USA. Customer service is also notably better. Mississippi, a state universally dumped on by other states and at the bottom of nearly metric to the point that there is a folk saying about it, https://en.m.wiki.org/thank_God_for_Mississippi has about a 20% higher GDP per capita than France. Salaries for almost any kind of skilled labor. If you're in the bottom 20% you'll make more in Europe. If you're anywhere above that you'll make significantly more in the US. Well, even here in Europe the bottom 20%, or bottom 40% here in Germany, don't have much from their relative wealth compared to the US, as living has become increasingly expensive and the last 7 governments simply have not done anything about it. Even right now, as it is worse than ever, most political parties here don't even have that topic in their campaign programs. Air conditioning. Came here to say this. Central air conditioning is something we take for granted in the US. I realized this when I started hearing countries in Europe getting summer heat waves and people dying by the thousands. Mortgages. Thankfully we still have FDR's 30-year fixed rate mortgage policy. I know buying a house is tough right now, but it would be a lot tougher, and for everyone, if our system worked like the 1920s or like Australia or the UK. I love my 20-year mortgage at a flat 2%. Lack of cigarette smoking, although vaping has picked up in recent years. Most definitely. However, if I'm being honest, I'd rather deal with folks hitting a jewel pod out front of the restaurant than someone honking a Marlboro. Ice. I am originally from Eastern Europe and have been living in the USA for over 20 years. I was visiting my grandma over there, and on a particularly humid day, I ordered an iced latte. The barista looked at me horrified. When I was in Spain, I went to a Starbucks because I couldn't find another coffee place open. It was like 35 degrees out, so I ordered a black iced coffee. Blank stares. I explained in broken Spanish what it was, and the barista gave me an Americano and a separate cup of ice. So I just dumped one on the judge, and honestly I didn't hate it. Handicap accessibility in public-private spaces. I am not American, but their national and state parks system is fucking glorious. Services, land set aside and protected, information, knowledgeable employees, infrastructure. No one else is even close. I have lived in 6 countries and traveled to more than 60. I still dream of American parks. Live near the Olympic National Forest Park. Takes all day just to circle it in a drive. In the US, it is your legal right to have any official government or healthcare service rendered to you in your native language. If you go on a murderous rampage in the US, and the only language you speak is Kaloya, the court must find a way to translate its proceedings into Kaloya, and must find a way to translate your own Kaloya into English. Americans like to complain about our judicial system, but it is objectively better than most. I think the Bill of Rights is also really great and has stood the test of time. I know people argue that we don't need the Second Amendment anymore, but I do think that is more powerful than people realize for their protection from the government. I wish more people understood the First, Fourth, and Fifth Amendments, as I think those are great rights and makes you more powerful than you think when dealing with government officials. Air conditioning and ADA. Accessibility for the disabled. Which is kind of depressing, because the US isn't all that great about it either. But once you've pushed someone in a wheelchair around Rome, it gives you a whole new perspective on things. I use a wheelchair and everyone goes on and on about how I should visit Europe, with Rome being one of the many examples. But I've seen the pictures, it looks terribly inaccessible. I don't want to risk thousands of dollars to travel only to be disappointed. Burgers and BBQ. Dealing with hot weather. I hear so many Europeans crack jokes at how we have AC everywhere and how we dress in loose, baggy clothing that is mostly made up in t-shirts and shorts, how we have to have ice in all of our drinks, how we are always thirsty and are drinking every other second. But then summer hits them and there are always a rash of articles of Europeans dropping like flies in the heat. Put in some window AC units if you can't put in central air. Wear baggy clothing. Stay hydrated. For Pete's sake, take some tips from people who live through this sort of weather every year. My cousins, from Sweden, made fun of me for taking my Hydra flask to a theme park when they visited. Guess who got heat exhaustion? Hint, not me. Ice water at restaurants. Even just water. Hydration. Being on a summer vacation outside the US means doing some sweaty activity all day, because no AC, and then sitting down to lunch with a thimbleful of room temperature water. Sending people to the moon. Might as well add landing stuff on Mars. Until China recently, everyone else was having a horrible time, but the USA can't seem to put a foot wrong. Right turn on red. Paying me. I make about 3 times as much here compared to there. I'm from Scotland and basically the only time in my life I've been truly loaded was working in the USA. Apparently last summer was particularly bad where due to the exchange rate, us tourists came to Europe and could not believe how cheap everything was.